There's something sitting on your dinner table tonight that has killed more people than most wars in history. It fed empires. It doubled the population of an entire continent. And then, in the span of just a few years, it wiped out a quarter of Ireland. You've eaten it 1,000 times. You probably don't think twice about it. It's a potato. Now before you click away, because yes, this is a video about a vegetable, here's what most people don't know. The potato has one of the strangest, most violent, most surprisingly relevant stories in the history of food. And almost none of it gets told. Europe refused to eat the potato for nearly 200 years. They thought it caused leprosy. One king had to trick his own citizens into trying it. And the trick he used was pure genius. And the people who understood the potato best, who grew it at 12,000 feet in the Andes Mountains for thousands of years before anyone else even knew it existed, knew things about this plant that modern science is only now starting to confirm. We're going to cover all of it. The history, the science, and what you can actually do differently the next time you cook one. It all starts not in Ireland, not in France, not in your grandmother's kitchen, but in the mountains of Peru. Long before a single European set foot in the Americas, the people of the Andes had already figured out the potato. We're talking about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, around the shores of Lake Titicaca, on the border of what is now Peru and Bolivia. That's older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than the wheel as most people know it. At a time when most of Europe was still hunting and gathering, communities in the high Andes had already spent generations selecting, breeding, and cultivating wild potato plants into reliable food crops. By the time the Inca Empire reached its peak, around the 1400s, they weren't growing one kind of potato. They were growing over 3,000 varieties, different sizes, different textures, different colors, yellow, red, deep purple, almost black. Some varieties were bred for high altitude, others for different soil types, others for flavor, or for how well they stored through a hard winter. The Inca also used the potato as a unit of time. Specific cooking times, how long it took a potato to reach a certain softness, were used to measure hours. And in some communities, a young woman's suitability as a wife was judged partly by how well she could peel one without waste. This was not a primitive relationship with food. This was a civilization with millennia of institutional knowledge about a single crop. But here's the part that should genuinely impress you. The Inca didn't just grow the potato. They figured out how to make it last for up to a decade without refrigeration. And they did it using nothing but cold air and sunlight. The technique is called chuño, and it works like this. After harvest, small potatoes are spread out on the ground at high altitude, above 12,000 feet, where the nights regularly drop to around 23 degrees Fahrenheit. The potatoes freeze solid overnight. Then, during the day, when the sun comes up and temperatures rise, farmers walk across them, pressing out the moisture with their feet, the same way you'd press grapes for wine. Then the potatoes freeze again at night. This cycle repeats for about 5 days, until nearly all the moisture is gone. What you're left with is a dried, shriveled, rock-hard potato that weighs about 20% of what it originally did, and can be stored for years without spoiling. Some families in the Bolivian highlands today still have their parents' chuño from 20 years ago. NASA didn't develop industrial freeze-drying until the early 20th century. The Inca had been doing the same thing, with just altitude and cold air, for centuries before that. The chuño served a military and strategic purpose too. Because it was lightweight and nearly indestructible, Inca soldiers carried it on long marches. The storehouses of the Inca Empire, called colcas, were stocked with chuño as a hedge against drought and famine. If a harvest failed in one region, the reserves could be transported across the vast road network to feed the affected population. The Inca had insurance, and they built it one harvest at a time. Now here's where it gets practical. The purple and deep-colored varieties the Inca prized contain high levels of anthocyanins, the same antioxidant compounds found in blueberries and red cabbage, linked in research to reduced inflammation and better cardiovascular health. And the way the Inca typically prepared their potatoes, boiled or steamed whole, often eaten cooled, turns out to be significantly better for blood sugar than the way most Americans eat them today. When you cook a potato and let it cool before eating, the starch structure changes into what researchers call resistant starch. Your body digests it more slowly. It feeds beneficial gut bacteria, and it produces a much lower blood sugar spike. We'll come back to exactly how to apply this when we get to the cooking section. The Spanish, who were about to show up and change everything, had none of that context. In 1532, the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru looking for gold and silver. He found both, and he also stumbled across something that would ultimately be worth far more to humanity than all the gold he ever extracted. Potatoes arrived in Spain around 1570, and for the next 2 centuries, Europe largely wanted nothing to do with them. The reasons were partly practical and partly cultural, and looking back, they seem almost comically misguided. But they made a certain kind of sense at the time. First, the plant itself was suspicious. It belongs to the nightshade family, which includes several genuinely toxic species. Its leaves and stems really are poisonous. Europeans who didn't know the difference between the plant and the tuber had legitimate reason to be cautious. Second, the potato doesn't appear in the Bible. In the 17th century, that mattered. If God hadn't seen fit to mention a food, some theologians argued, perhaps Christians shouldn't eat it. The potato grew underground, in the dark, which in the medieval European imagination was associated with sin, with the devil, and with things that shouldn't be trusted. And third, and this is the one that really stuck, people noticed that the potato's knobby, irregular skin, with its dark spots and pitted surface, looked a lot like the hands of someone suffering from leprosy. In 1748, the French Parliament made it official. They banned the cultivation of potatoes for human consumption on the grounds that eating them caused leprosy. For 24 years, it was literally illegal to grow potatoes for people to eat in France. They were fine for pigs, apparently, but not for humans. Meanwhile, in Prussia, what is now northern Germany, King Frederick the Great was dealing with famine and trying to get his subjects to eat the potato as a solution. They refused. When he sent an official order in 1774 demanding that farmers plant potatoes, the town of Kolberg sent back a letter that reportedly said, "The things have neither smell nor taste, not even the dogs will eat them, so what use are they to us?" Frederick tried ordering. He tried explaining. Neither worked. So the legend goes that he tried something else entirely. He declared the potato a royal vegetable, reserved for the king. He planted a royal potato field and stationed guards around it day and night, with very visible instructions that no one was to touch the crop. Then he quietly told the guards to take lots of naps. Curious peasants noticed the guards. They noticed the field. They thought, if it's worth guarding, it must be worth having. Bold ones started sneaking in at night to steal a few. They brought the potatoes home, tasted them, and found they were perfectly fine to eat. Within a few years, potatoes were growing all over Prussia. Historians debate whether this story happened exactly as told. The archive evidence is thinner than the legend. But what is documented is that Prussia adopted the potato, and that adoption saved the country from famines that otherwise might have been catastrophic. Frederick's grave in Potsdam to this day regularly has fresh potatoes left on it. He's remembered there as the Potato King. In France, it took one man's stubborn personal experience to finally break through. Antoine Augustin Parmentier was a young French pharmacist when he was captured by the Prussians during the 7 Years' War in the 1750s. For 3 years, as a prisoner of war, he was fed primarily potatoes. When he walked out of that prison in 1763, he was in better health than when he went in. He spent the next decade trying to convince France that the thing they had banned as a cause of leprosy had just kept him alive for 3 years. By 1772, the ban had been repealed, but Parmentier didn't stop there. He hosted famous potato dinners in Paris, invited prominent guests, including Benjamin Franklin, and convinced Queen Marie Antoinette to wear a sprig of potato flowers in her hair at court. The dish that still carries his name today, hotchis parmentier, a layered baked potato and meat dish similar to shepherd's pie, was deliberately designed to be elegant. His technique of slow baking at moderate heat keeps the potato from turning watery, which is the main problem home cooks run into when they rush the oven temperature. By the early 1800s, Europe had made its peace with the potato, and then it went further than that. Europe became completely dependent on it, and that dependence was about to have consequences that no one saw coming. Before the potato became a common food crop in Europe, the continent was trapped in a brutal cycle. Bad harvests meant famine. Famine meant death, especially among the rural poor. And it wasn't occasional, it was recurring, predictable, and seemingly inescapable. The potato broke that cycle. A field of potatoes produces roughly 4 times the calories per acre as the same field planted with grain. The potato also grows in poor soil, survives cold temperatures, and doesn't require the same complex seasonal timing that wheat does. For a family living on a small plot of marginal land, potatoes were not just a food option, they were a lifeline. Between 1750 and 1850, the population of Europe grew from roughly 140 million people to 266 million, almost doubled in a century. Historians and economists have calculated that somewhere between 12 and 26% of that growth can be directly attributed to the adoption of the potato as a staple crop. A family of 4 could grow enough calories to survive on about a third of the land they would have needed before. That freed up people to leave farms and work in factories, which is part of what made the Industrial Revolution possible. 1 plant, 1 century, nearly double the people. That's not a food story. That's a civilization story. Nowhere in Europe did the potato take hold more completely than in Ireland, and the reasons made perfect, tragic sense. Ireland, in the late 18th and early 19th century, was a deeply unequal place. Most of the arable land was owned by British landlords and used to grow grain for export. The Irish rural poor worked as tenant farmers on small plots, with almost no margin for error. For those families, the potato was not a choice. It was the only crop that could reliably feed a family of 6 on a half-acre of rocky ground. A single acre of potatoes, combined with a little milk, provided essentially all the nutrients an adult needs. Between 1750 and 1841, the population of Ireland grew from about 3 million to over 8 million people. By the early 1840s, roughly half of Ireland's population was depending on the potato for the majority of their calories. In the west of Ireland, that number was closer to 80 or even 90%, and almost all of them were growing the same variety, the Irish lumper. Productive, easy to grow, reliable in Irish soil and climate. But it had one weakness that nobody fully understood yet. It had almost no genetic diversity. Every lumper was essentially a clone of every other lumper. No variation, no backup. The entire food supply of half a nation, built on a single genetic thread. Remember the Inca, with their 3,000 varieties, each one handling different pests, different weather, different conditions? If one failed, the others survived. Ireland had none of that redundancy. If you're enjoying this video, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one in the series, because what happens next is where this story gets truly dark. That's not just a farming problem, that's a loaded gun. The summer of 1845 started normally in Ireland. Planting was done, the fields were green. Families who had eaten almost nothing but potatoes for their entire lives had no reason to expect anything different. Then, sometime in late July and August, farmers began to notice something wrong. Not in one field, in all of them. A plant that looked healthy in the morning could be found black and wilted by afternoon. Potatoes dug from the ground appeared fine on the surface, but were soft and rotten inside, giving off a smell described by witnesses as overwhelming. By the end of the growing season, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Ireland's entire potato crop was gone. The culprit was a pathogen called Phytophthora infestans, a water mold more closely related to brown algae than to true fungus. It had originated in the highlands of Mexico, spread to North America, and crossed the Atlantic on ships. The spores could travel on the wind for miles, infecting new fields in days, and it hit a crop with no genetic defenses because every plant in the ground was a genetic copy of every other plant in the ground. The Irish lumper had never faced this disease before. It had no resistance. There was nowhere for it to go. The first year was desperate. The second year, 1846, was catastrophic. The blight returned and wiped out nearly the entire crop. In 1847, a shortage of seed potatoes meant that only about a quarter of normal acreage was even planted. By 1848 and 1849, the disease struck again. For 7 consecutive years, the staple crop of half a nation either failed or produced far too little to feed the people who depended on it. Ireland at the time was part of the United Kingdom, governed from London. And throughout the famine years, Ireland continued to export food, grain, livestock, butter, to Britain. The British government's primary response was rooted in laissez-faire economic theory. The government should not interfere with market forces, even in a famine. Relief efforts were begun and then cut back. Soup kitchens were established and then closed. Workhouses, institutions where starving people could receive food in exchange for labor, were so overwhelmed and so poorly supplied that they became centers of disease. People who walked miles to reach a workhouse sometimes died before they got to the door. Whether the British response was pure policy failure or something worse, historians still argue today. What is not debated is the outcome. Between 1845 and 1852, approximately 1 million people in Ireland died of starvation or disease. Ireland's population fell from about 8.2 million in 1841 to 6.6 million by 1851, and it never recovered. Today, more than 170 years later, the island of Ireland still has a lower population than it did before the famine. Another 1.5 million people fled during those same years, on ships so overcrowded and poorly provisioned that many passengers died at sea. They became known as coffin ships. In 7 years, one country lost roughly a quarter of its people because they had built their entire food supply on a single crop with no backup, and that crop failed. If that story feels distant, consider this. About 32 million Americans, nearly 10% of the entire U.S. population, identify as having Irish ancestry. The majority of those families trace their American story back to a ship that left during the famine years. The Irish-American communities that shaped Boston, New York, and Chicago, their politics, their Catholic parishes, their police precincts, grew directly from people who had nothing left but the hope that somewhere across the Atlantic had to be better than this. The potato famine didn't just happen in Ireland. Its consequences are still sitting in American cities right now. If your family is one of them, drop where in Ireland they came from in the comments. I'd genuinely love to know. Somewhere in the 1980s and 1990s, the potato became a villain. Low-carb diets, Atkins, the general war on starch. The potato got lumped in with white bread and sugar as something to avoid if you wanted to be healthy. That framing got a lot wrong. A medium potato, boiled with the skin on, contains 27 milligrams of vitamin C, about 30% of the recommended daily value. It contains 620 milligrams of potassium, more than a banana, which meaningfully helps regulate blood pressure. It has vitamin B6, iron, magnesium, and fiber. Essentially no fat, no cholesterol, and no sodium. For 110 calories, it is one of the most nutritionally dense foods you can eat. The problem was never the potato. The problem was what Americans started doing to the potato: deep frying it, loading it with butter and sour cream, pressing it into fast food shapes. McDonald's is technically one of the largest potato buyers in the world. What they do to those potatoes before serving them has almost no relationship to what a potato actually is. As Parmentier showed 250 years ago, the potato is whatever you make of it. As for how to cook it, I mentioned earlier how the Inca boiled and steamed their potatoes whole, and how cooling them creates resistant starch that's better for your gut and your blood sugar. That's still the simplest upgrade you can make. Cook with the skin on. Steam instead of boil when you can, and let them cool before eating. 3 changes, no new ingredients. And if you want to go further, look for the varieties the Inca actually grew. Purple Peruvian and all blue potatoes contain up to 4 times the anthocyanins of a standard russet. Russian banana fingerlings have a natural buttery flavor that needs almost no added fat. They're available at most farmers markets and specialty grocers, and they taste nothing like what most of us grew up eating. The Incas spent thousands of years protecting that diversity. We spent about 200 years narrowing it down to whatever was easiest to ship. Ireland showed us what happens when that narrowing goes too far. Which brings us to the lesson underneath all of this, one that has nothing to do with food and everything to do with how systems fail. When you depend on a single thing, one crop, one supplier, one source of income, one skill set, you are building a system with no margin for error. The Inca understood this and engineered redundancy into everything they grew. Ireland didn't, and paid a price that still marks the country 170 years later. That pattern shows up everywhere today, in agricultural monocultures, in global supply chains built around a single assumption, in companies that rely on one product or one platform. The potato didn't invent that lesson, but it taught it in the most unforgettable way possible. The potato hasn't changed. What we know about it has. So the next time you see a potato sitting on your counter, you'll know a little more of the story behind it. Not just a vegetable, a 10,000-year-old piece of human history that fed empires, broke nations, and quietly shaped the city you might be living in right now. If you found this useful, share it with someone who thinks they already know everything about what they eat. And subscribe if you want more. Next up in this series is the history of salt, which is somehow even stranger than this. Thanks for watching.